Welcome to Red Moonlight Library. Before we start, please subscribe. Chapter 1. The memory of laughter haunted her. Not the laughter of joy, but the brittle, mocking kind that echoed in corridors and family gatherings. Maggie remembered the way her mother-in-law's voice would rise above the chatter, sharp as glass. A wife who cannot give children is no wife at all. The words had been spoken years ago, yet they clung to her like frost, refusing to melt. She had smiled then, pretending not to hear, but inside, her heart had cracked. Every visit to her husband's family became a trial, every holiday a reminder of her failure. Cousins paraded their children, sisters-in-law compared pregnancies, and Maggie sat in silence, her hands folded, her smile fixed. She was scorned not for who she was, but for what she could not give. In the quiet of her home, she replayed those moments. The whispers at church, the pitying glances from neighbors, the subtle withdrawal of friends who no longer invited her to playdates or family outings. She remembered sitting alone in her kitchen, the ticking clock louder than her thoughts, wondering if her worth had been reduced to a womb that refused to cooperate. Her marriage began to fracture under the weight of silence. At first, Carl had been patient. He held her hand through doctor visits, reassured her with promises of someday. But someday stretched into years, and patience thinned. Maggie remembered the way his eyes began to wander, the way his voice grew sharper, the way his touch became rare. He never said the words outright, but she felt them in every sigh, every late night, every absence. "You have failed me." The memories came in fragments, like shards of glass. One evening, she had overheard him on the phone, his voice low, his laughter warm in a way it no longer was with her. She had stood in the hallway, clutching the wall, listening to the intimacy of a conversation not meant for her. He had hung up quickly when he saw her, his smile forced, his explanation flimsy. Maggie had nodded, but inside, suspicion bloomed. Another memory, the night he came home late, smelling faintly of perfume that was not hers. She had asked no questions, fearing the answers. Silence became her shield, but also her prison. She lived in denial, convincing herself that love could survive betrayal, that marriage could endure scorn. Yet the isolation grew. Friends drifted away, family judged, husband withdrew. Maggie found herself alone in rooms filled with people, her voice unheard, her presence unnoticed. She remembered sitting at a dinner table, surrounded by relatives, as conversations flowed around her. Someone joked about her empty nest, and laughter erupted. Maggie had smiled, her face burning, her heart sinking. She excused herself, retreating to the bathroom, where she stared at her reflection and whispered, "I am more than this." But the mirror offered no comfort. Her memories of doctors were no kinder. The sterile rooms, the cold instruments, the clinical words, unexplained infertility. She remembered the way one doctor had shrugged, as though her pain were trivial. Another had suggested adoption, his tone dismissive, as though biology were irrelevant. Maggie had nodded politely, but inside, she screamed. She wanted not just a child, but a child who carried her blood, her legacy, her defiance against scorn. The fracture in her marriage widened. Carl began to spend more time away, his excuses thin. Maggie remembered the night he told her, bluntly, "Maybe we should stop trying." His voice was tired, his eyes distant. She had nodded, but inside, despair bloomed. To stop trying was to surrender, to accept failure, to let scorn win. She could not. In her solitude, Maggie began to dream of desperate choices. She remembered sitting in her bedroom, the curtains drawn, the silence heavy, imagining a child with Carl's eyes, Carl's smile. She imagined the laughter of a son, the warmth of a daughter. She imagined walking into family gatherings with a child at her side, silencing whispers, erasing scorn. The dream became obsession, the obsession became resolve. Her past memories fueled her desperation. Every insult, every whisper, every sigh from Carl became a spark, igniting her determination. She remembered the way her mother-in-law had once said, "A barren woman brings shame." Maggie had clenched her fists, vowing that shame would not define her. The narrative of her life was written in silence, but silence was no longer enough. Maggie began to plan, to scheme, to imagine choices that would rewrite her story. She remembered the first time she thought of IVF, the way the word had sounded like salvation. She remembered researching late at night, her eyes burning, her heart racing. She remembered the moment she realized that science could offer what nature had denied. But even in those moments of hope, memories of scorn lingered. She remembered the way Carl had dismissed the idea at first, his voice sharp, "It's unnatural." She remembered the way he had softened later, his desperation matching hers, his pride bending under pressure. She remembered the relief she felt when he finally agreed, the way her heart soared with possibility. Yet beneath the hope lay fear. Maggie remembered the whispers of betrayal, the perfume on his clothes, the late-night calls. She remembered the way his eyes lingered on others, the way his touch grew cold. She feared that even with IVF, even with a child, betrayal would remain. Her memories became a tapestry of scorn and silence, woven with threads of pain and defiance. She remembered every insult, every whisper, every sigh. She remembered the way her marriage fractured, the way her heart broke, the way her resolve hardened. She remembered the silence that defined her, the scorn that haunted her, the isolation that consumed her. And in those memories, she found the seed of desperate choice. Maggie would not surrender to scorn. She would not let silence define her. She would rewrite her story, even if it meant deception. She would bribe the doctor, she would choose a donor, she would create a child who carried not just blood but defiance. Her past memories were not just recollections, they were fuel. They set the stage for the choices she would make, the deception she would embrace, the legacy she would create. Maggie's life had been defined by scorn and silence, but her future would be defined by resilience and defiance. Chapter 2. Maggie remembered the night Carl finally agreed. It had taken years of silence, years of scorn, years of watching their marriage fracture under the weight of infertility. He had resisted at first, calling IVF unnatural, dismissing it as desperation. But desperation had become their reality. His mother's whispers, his family's judgment, the mistress's shadow, all of it pressed against him until his pride bent. "I suppose we can try," he had said, his voice reluctant, his eyes distant. Maggie had nodded, hiding the surge of relief that threatened to spill over. She knew this was not victory, it was concession. But concession was enough. IVF was a door, and she intended to walk through it, even if she had to deceive him to do so. Her deceit began quietly. She researched donors late at night, her eyes burning from the glow of the screen. She sought intelligence, resilience, strength, traits Carl admired but did not possess in abundance. She wanted a child who would silence scorn, who would embody brilliance, who would carry a legacy beyond betrayal. She found him, a donor whose profile mirrored Carl's appearance but carried the genetic markers of high intelligence and strong fertility. The bribe was subtle. She approached the doctor with calm determination, her voice steady, her smile polite. "I want this donor," she said, sliding the envelope across the desk. The doctor hesitated, but money spoke louder than ethics. Maggie's choice was secured. Carl would never know. He would believe the child was his, and Maggie would protect her marriage, her future, her dignity. Her resolution was firm. She told herself it was survival, not betrayal. She rationalized the deceit as necessity, as defiance against scorn. "I am protecting us," she whispered to herself, her hand pressed against her chest. "I am protecting our marriage, our future." The words became mantra, silencing guilt, strengthening resolve. Carl played his part with successful foolery. He attended appointments, signed papers, smiled for nurses. He believed the narrative Maggie had crafted, believed that science would give them what nature had denied. He never questioned, never suspected. His pride was soothed by the illusion of control, his ego satisfied by the promise of fatherhood. Maggie watched him, her heart heavy with deceit, but her face calm, her voice reassuring. She remembered the day of the procedure, the sterile room, the cold instruments, the doctor's steady hands. Carl sat beside her, his expression tense but hopeful. Maggie closed her eyes, whispering silent prayers, not for truth, but for success. She prayed that the child would thrive, that the deception would hold, that the future she had crafted would become reality. Weeks passed, and the test confirmed it: she was pregnant. Relief flooded her, mingled with guilt and triumph. Carl's joy was clumsy, his laughter awkward, but Maggie embraced it. She let him believe, let him celebrate, let him carry the illusion of fatherhood. Her deceit had succeeded, her resolution had borne fruit, her marriage had been salvaged, at least for now. Yet beneath the joy lay shadows. Maggie knew the truth, carried it like a secret wound. She knew the child was not Carl's, knew the deception was fragile, knew the future was uncertain. But she also knew that survival demanded sacrifice, that dignity demanded defiance, that scorn demanded silence. She had chosen deceit, and she would live with it. Her memories of scorn fueled her resolve. She remembered the whispers, the laughter, the judgment. She remembered the fracture in her marriage, the shadow of betrayal. She remembered the silence that had consumed her, the isolation that had defined her. And she remembered the moment she chose defiance, the moment she bribed the doctor, the moment she rewrote her story. Carl's foolery continued. He paraded his pride, spoke of fatherhood, basked in admiration. He believed the child was his, believed the marriage had been salvaged, believed the future was secure. Maggie watched him, her heart heavy but her resolve unbroken. She had deceived him, but she had also protected him, from scorn, from shame, from truth. Her pregnancy became both burden and blessing. The weight slowed her, the fatigue deepened, but the life inside her became anchor, purpose, defiance. She whispered to the child, promising survival, promising love, promising legacy. "You are my triumph," she said. "You are my future." The months passed, and Maggie carried her secret with grace. Her resolution was firm, her deceit successful, her husband fooled. Chapter 3. The room was filled with light and sterile silence, broken only by the rhythm of her breathing and the steady encouragement of nurses. Maggie gripped the edge of the bed, sweat beading on her forehead, her body trembling with exhaustion. Yet beneath the pain lay a fierce determination. This was not just childbirth, it was vindication. When the cry finally pierced the air, Maggie's heart surged. The sound was raw, fragile, yet powerful enough to silence years of scorn. She looked at the tiny form placed in her arms, his skin flushed, his fists clenched, his eyes blinking against the brightness of the world. Her son. Her triumph. Her defiance. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "You are mine." She pressed her lips to his forehead, inhaling the scent of new life. The weight of betrayal, the years of silence, the whispers of failure, all dissolved in that moment. She had carried deceit, bribed a doctor, chosen a donor, but none of it mattered now. What mattered was survival, legacy, hope. Carl entered, his face pale with awe. Maggie watched him, her heart heavy with secrets. He believed this child was his, believed that science had given them what nature had denied. His joy was clumsy, his laughter awkward, but Maggie let him believe. She smiled, her voice steady, her arms cradling the child. "He's perfect," she said. The days that followed were filled with fragile peace. Maggie rocked her son to sleep, whispered prayers into the night, journaled her thoughts in quiet moments. She felt the weight of deception, but also the strength of resolution. She had protected her marriage, silenced scorn, rewritten her story. Her son was proof, her son was shield, her son was hope. Yet shadows lingered. Maggie knew the truth, carried it like a hidden scar. She knew the child was not Carl's, knew the deception was fragile, knew the future was uncertain. But she also knew that survival demanded sacrifice, that dignity demanded defiance, that scorn demanded silence. She had chosen deceit, and she would live with it. Her son's laughter became balm, his cries became rhythm, his presence became anchor. Maggie whispered to him, promising love, promising legacy. "You are my triumph," she said. You are my defiance. You are my future. For now, peace reigned. For now, joy silenced scorn. For now, hope carried her forward. Carl had never believed it would happen. Years of disappointment had hardened him, years of whispers had eroded his patience. He had agreed to IVF reluctantly, convinced it was futile, convinced it was unnatural. Yet now, standing in the hospital room, watching Maggie cradle their son, he felt something he had not felt in years: pride. The child was small, fragile, yet perfect. Carl's chest swelled as he leaned closer, touching the tiny fingers that curled around his own. "My son," he whispered, his voice trembling. He believed it, believed the narrative Maggie had crafted, believed that science had given him what nature had denied. His pride was soothed, his ego satisfied, his legacy secured. He paraded his joy, spoke of fatherhood, basked in admiration. Family visited, friends congratulated, whispers of scorn silenced. Carl smiled, his laughter awkward but genuine. He believed the marriage had been salvaged, believed the future was secure, believed the child was his. Maggie's smile reassured him, her calm voice soothed him, her steady presence anchored him. He never questioned, never suspected. His pride blinded him, his joy silenced doubt. He was father, he was husband, he was man redeemed. The days that followed were filled with fragile peace. Carl held his son, whispered promises, imagined futures. He saw brilliance in the child's eyes, strength in his grip, legacy in his presence. He believed the child would carry his name, his blood, his pride. He believed the deception was truth, the illusion was reality. Chapter 4. Years had passed since Maggie's son was born. The boy had grown into a bright, precocious child, his intelligence already evident in the way he questioned the world, his resilience mirroring his mother's. For Maggie, those years had been a fragile piece, her secret intact, her marriage outwardly stable, her son the center of her universe. Carl basked in fatherhood, convinced the child was his, and Maggie allowed the illusion to persist. But peace is fragile, and betrayal has a way of resurfacing. It began with whispers. Maggie noticed Carl's absences growing longer, his excuses thinner. He returned home smelling faintly of perfume, his laughter warmer when speaking on the phone than when speaking to her. Maggie had lived with suspicion before, but now the shadows grew darker, heavier. She sensed something looming, though she could not yet name it. The confrontation arrived unannounced. One afternoon, as Maggie prepared lunch, the doorbell rang. She opened it to find a woman standing there, poised and defiant, with two boys at her side. The resemblance was undeniable: Carl's eyes, Carl's jawline, Carl's smirk etched into their young faces. Maggie's breath caught, her heart pounding. "I'm here for what's mine," the woman said, her voice sharp. "These are Carl's sons." The words fell like stones, shattering the fragile peace Maggie had built. She stared at the twins, their presence a living accusation. Her mind raced, her heart broke, her resolve trembled. She had carried deceit, bribed a doctor, chosen a donor, but Carl's betrayal was now undeniable, embodied in flesh and blood. Carl arrived moments later, his face pale, his eyes darting between Maggie and the mistress. He stammered, tried to explain, but the truth was already laid bare. The mistress spoke with confidence, recounting years of secrecy, nights of passion, promises Carl had made. She claimed legitimacy, demanded recognition, sought to dismantle Maggie's marriage with the force of truth. The scandal erupted. Neighbors whispered, family judged, friends recoiled. Maggie became the center of pity and gossip, her marriage dissected in hushed tones. The mistress paraded her twins, flaunting their resemblance to Carl, asserting her claim. Maggie's dignity was stripped, her silence shattered, her secret threatened. The confrontation between Maggie and Carl was brutal. She demanded answers, he offered excuses. She accused, he denied. She wept, he grew defensive. The mistress's presence loomed, her twins a constant reminder of betrayal. Maggie's heart broke, but her resolve hardened. She had endured scorn, carried deceit, survived isolation. She would not endure this. The divorce was inevitable. Maggie filed papers, her voice steady, her hands trembling. She walked away from the marriage, shattered but resolute. She carried her son, her secret, her dignity. She refused to be defined by betrayal, refused to be silenced by scandal. She chose defiance, chose survival, chose freedom. Carl's pride crumbled. He had believed himself clever, believed his affair hidden, believed his deception sustainable. But the mistress's arrival exposed him, dismantled his lies, destroyed his marriage. He watched Maggie walk away, her son at her side, her resolve unbroken. He regretted, but regret was too late. The mistress celebrated her victory, flaunting her twins, claiming Carl's name. But victory was hollow. Scandal consumed them, whispers followed them, judgment haunted them. Maggie's departure left Carl stripped, his dignity eroded, his legacy fractured. Maggie, though shattered, found strength in her son. Her son became her anchor, her defiance, her hope. She was broken, but not defeated. Chapter 5. The boy who had once been whispered about as the child of silence grew into a figure impossible to ignore. From his earliest years, Maggie's son displayed brilliance that startled teachers and impressed mentors. He solved complex puzzles before most children could read, wrote algorithms in adolescence, and spoke with the confidence of someone decades older. His ambition was relentless, his vision expansive. By the time he reached his 20s, he had already founded a tech company that disrupted industries. Within a few short years, he became the youngest billionaire in the region, reshaping markets with innovations that blended artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and global commerce. The media seized upon his story. Headlines screamed. From shadows to spotlight, the youngest billionaire emerges. Son redefines success, a prodigy who outpaced his generation. The legacy of resilience, how one mother's sacrifice bore fruit. Television anchors narrated his rise with awe. He is not just a businessman, one reporter declared during a primetime segment, he is a phenomenon. His ideas are changing the way we live, work, and connect. And behind him stands a mother whose quiet sacrifice made this possible. In interviews, the young billionaire spoke with humility but also with sharp clarity. "My mother taught me resilience," he said in one widely circulated clip. "She endured scorn, betrayal, and silence, but she never surrendered. Everything I am is because she believed in me." Audiences were captivated. Social media erupted with admiration, hashtags trending globally, hashtag prodigy son, hashtag mother of resilience, hashtag youngest billionaire. Maggie herself became a figure of fascination, though she remained private, preferring to let her son's achievements speak for both of them. Business magazines featured glossy spreads of him in sleek offices, surrounded by innovation. "The boy who was once dismissed," one article wrote, "has become the man everyone envies." But admiration was not universal. Envy simmered beneath the surface. Former classmates, distant relatives, and even estranged family members whispered about his success. He was always different, some said with grudging respect. Others muttered, "It's luck. It's not just brilliance, it's connections." The mistress who had once flaunted her twin sons now watched from the sidelines, bitterness etched into her face. Her children struggled with mediocrity, their lives marked by comparison to the prodigy they could never match. Carl, too, felt the sting of regret. He had once scorned Maggie, dismissed her, betrayed her. Now he watched as the son he had abandoned in spirit became a global icon, while he himself sank into obscurity. Media outlets did not spare him. "The father who walked away," one investigative piece read, "now lives in poverty, overshadowed by the brilliance of the son he once dismissed." The contrast was stark, the narrative merciless. Maggie's sacrifice had borne fruit, while Carl's betrayal had led to ruin. Documentaries began to frame Maggie's story as central to her son's rise. Narrators spoke with reverence. She was scorned for not bearing children. She endured whispers, isolation, betrayal. Yet she chose defiance, chose survival, chose to rewrite her story. Her son became her legacy, her triumph, her vindication. Today, he stands as the youngest billionaire, reshaping industries, while she remains the quiet force behind his brilliance. Audiences wept, inspired by the narrative of resilience. Maggie's sacrifice was no longer hidden, it was celebrated. Her deceit in IVF, once a secret, was reframed as a desperate act of survival, a choice that gave the world a prodigy. As her son expanded his empire, opening research centers, funding education initiatives, and investing in sustainability, the world watched with admiration and envy. Politicians sought his endorsement, universities invited him to speak, entrepreneurs chased his mentorship. Yet through it all, he remained grounded, always returning to Maggie. "She is my compass," he told one interviewer. "Without her, there is no me." The media framed it as poetic justice, the woman once scorned now revered, the child once doubted now envied. Maggie's sacrifice had borne fruit beyond imagination. The story became legend. Maggie's son was not just the youngest billionaire, he was the embodiment of resilience, ambition, and vindication. His rise reshaped industries, but more importantly, it reshaped narratives. Where once Maggie had been scorned, she was now celebrated. Where once whispers had condemned her, headlines now praised her. Her sacrifice had borne fruit, her son had become a prodigy, and together they had transformed betrayal into triumph. And in the shadows of envy, Carl and the mistress lived with regret, their poverty a stark reminder of choices made and consequences endured. Chapter 6. Carl's life had collapsed into obscurity. Once proud, once admired, he now lived in the shadow of poverty. His mistress, once radiant with triumph, had grown bitter, her twin sons ordinary and unimpressive compared to Maggie's prodigy. Every headline about Maggie's son, the youngest billionaire, the visionary reshaping industries, was a dagger to Carl's pride. He began to plot. In his mind, reconciliation was not about love or remorse, it was about survival. He imagined himself walking back into Maggie's life, cloaked in humility, begging forgiveness. He rehearsed speeches in the mirror, "I was lost, but I see now. Let me be part of our son's life." He convinced himself that if he could appeal to Maggie's compassion, she might allow him back into the circle of wealth and status. But beneath the rehearsed sorrow lay calculation. Carl wanted access to the empire his son had built. He wanted the comfort of riches, the prestige of association, the redemption of being seen as father to a billionaire. His regret was not moral, it was opportunistic. The mistress, too, saw opportunity. Her twins had failed to rise, their mediocrity a constant reminder of her miscalculation. She had once believed Carl's promises, once flaunted her victory over Maggie. Now she lived in the ruins of that triumph, her sons overshadowed, her own reputation tarnished. She devised her own strategy. "We must approach her together," she told Carl, her voice sharp. "If we show unity, if we show remorse, she might soften." She rehearsed her lines, crafting a performance of contrition. She would play the role of the repentant woman, the mother seeking reconciliation, the figure who admitted fault but begged for mercy. Her plan was deception layered over desperation. She intended to fool Maggie with tears, with apologies, with promises of peace. She imagined herself sitting across from Maggie, her voice trembling, her eyes moist, saying, "I was wrong. I stole what was yours. But let us heal now, for the sake of the children." When Carl finally stood before Maggie, the years of distance weighed heavily. He looked older, worn, stripped of pride. Maggie, by contrast, stood tall, her presence commanding, her eyes sharp with resilience. "Maggie," he began, his voice low, rehearsed sorrow dripping from every syllable. "I made mistakes. I was blind. I was weak. But I see now. I regret everything. Please, let me be part of our son's life." Maggie listened, her face unreadable. She remembered the scorn, the betrayal, the mistress's arrival with twin sons. She remembered the silence, the divorce, the years of struggle. She remembered the deceit she had carried, the sacrifice she had made, the triumph her son had become. Her voice was steady when she replied. You regret poverty, not betrayal. You regret being excluded, not what you did. My son does not need you. I do not need you. Leave. Carl's rehearsed sorrow crumbled. He reached out, desperate, but Maggie stepped back. Her resolve was unbroken, her defiance clear. In private, Carl and the mistress argued. He accused her of pushing him into confrontation, she accused him of weakness. Their unity fractured, their plan unraveling. You promised she would listen, Carl hissed. You failed to convince her, the mistress snapped. She saw through us, he muttered, bitterness rising. She always did, she replied, her voice cold. Their alliance, once built on betrayal, now collapsed under failure. They had sought wealth, status, reconciliation, but found only rejection. The mistress made her own attempt. She approached Maggie alone, her voice trembling, her eyes moist, her performance carefully rehearsed. Maggie, she said softly, I was wrong. I stole what was yours. I thought I had one, but I lost everything. Please, let us heal now, for the sake of the children. Maggie's gaze was steady, her silence heavy. She remembered the day the mistress had stood at her door, twins at her side, her voice sharp with triumph. She remembered the humiliation, the scandal, the divorce. She remembered the years of struggle, the sacrifice she had made, the triumph her son had become. Her reply was cold, resolute. You came to me once with arrogance. You come now with desperation. I owe you nothing. My son owes you nothing. Leave. The mistress's tears fell, but Maggie did not soften. Her resolve was unbroken, her defiance clear. Carl and the mistress had sought wealth, status, reconciliation. They had plotted, rehearsed, performed. But Maggie saw through them, her strength forged in betrayal, her resolve unbroken. She rejected them, leaving them to poverty, to regret, to the ruins of their choices. Maggie's sacrifice had borne fruit. Her son was prodigy, billionaire, visionary. Her dignity was intact, her legacy secure. Carl and the mistress, once triumphant, now lived with regret, their deception exposed, their poverty inevitable. Chapter 7. I had watched my mother reject them, my father and his mistress, without hesitation. Her voice was steady, her eyes unyielding. She had endured scorn, betrayal, and humiliation, yet she stood taller than ever. Their pleas fell on deaf ears, their rehearsed sorrow dissolved into silence. And I, her son, understood why. They had sought wealth, status, reconciliation. They had plotted, rehearsed, performed. But my mother saw through them. She had lived through their cruelty, carried her secret, borne her sacrifice. She owed them nothing. Their consequence was utter poverty. Stripped of dignity, stripped of power, they lived in the ruins of their choices. My father, once proud, now wandered in obscurity. The mistress, once triumphant, now bitter. Their twins, once flaunted, now ordinary. I often thought of the contrast. When they were a family of three, my mother, my father, and me, there had been moments of fragile peace. My father had paraded his pride, convinced I was his, basking in admiration. My mother had smiled, strong in his eyes, but broken behind closed doors. I remembered her tears at night, her whispered prayers, her silent resolve. She had carried pain alone, shielding me from it, protecting me with her strength. Now, my father lived with a family of four, the mistress and her twins. But where once he had basked in pride, now he lived in regret. The twins were shadows of ambition, ordinary in a world that demanded brilliance. The mistress was bitter, her triumph hollow. Their family was fractured, consumed by poverty, haunted by envy. The comparison was stark. My mother had endured betrayal, but she had risen. My father had embraced deceit, but he had fallen. I remembered my mother's strength. To the world, she was resilient, defiant, unbroken. But behind closed doors, she had broken down. I remembered her tears, her whispered prayers, her trembling hands. I remembered the nights she sat in silence, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with grief. She had carried pain alone, but she had never surrendered. Her strength was not the absence of weakness, it was the defiance of it. She had endured scorn, betrayal, humiliation, but she had risen. She had carried me, protected me, nurtured me. She had sacrificed, deceived, endured. And her sacrifice had borne fruit. I had inherited her resilience, her defiance, her ambition. My intelligence became my weapon, my shield, my legacy. I built industries, reshaped markets, became the youngest billionaire. I silenced whispers, dismantled scorn, rewrote narratives. And I ensured my father remained in poverty. I used my influence, my networks, my power to close doors to him. Every opportunity he sought, I blocked. Every plea he made, I silenced. Every attempt to re-enter my life, I rejected. He had abandoned my mother, betrayed her, humiliated her. He had forfeited his place in my life. My intelligence was not just brilliance, it was justice. I ensured that betrayal carried consequences, that deceit led to ruin, that scorn was silenced. My father lived in poverty, stripped of dignity, stripped of power. I stood as living proof of resilience, intelligence, and justice. My mother's sacrifice had borne fruit, her defiance had become legacy, her pain had become triumph. My father and his mistress lived in poverty, stripped of dignity, consumed by regret. The comparison was clear, a family of 3, fractured by betrayal, versus a family of 4, consumed by poverty. My mother had been strong in his eyes, but broken behind closed doors. Yet her strength had endured, her sacrifice had triumphed, her legacy had risen. And I, her son, stood as proof. Chapter 8. Maggie sat by the window of her quiet home, the late afternoon light spilling across the floor in golden threads. Years had passed since the storm of betrayal, since the mistress had arrived with her twin sons, since Carl had begged for reconciliation. She had rejected them, and their consequence had been utter poverty, stripped of dignity, stripped of power, left to wander in the ruins of their choices. Her son's laughter echoed faintly from the garden, a reminder of the life she had fought to protect. He was no longer the fragile child she had once cradled in trembling arms. He was a man now, brilliant and ambitious, the youngest billionaire whose name was spoken with awe across industries. His empire stretched across continents, reshaping technology, commerce, and sustainability. Yet for Maggie, his greatest triumph was not wealth but resilience. He was living proof that sacrifice bore fruit, that betrayal could be transformed into justice. Carl's life was a stark contrast. Once, they had been a family of 3, Maggie, Carl, and their son. She remembered how he had looked at her with admiration when she appeared strong, how he had paraded his pride in fatherhood. But behind closed doors, she had broken down. She remembered nights of tears, whispered prayers, trembling hands. She had carried pain alone, shielding her son from it, protecting him with her strength. Carl had never seen the full weight of her suffering, only the mask she wore to keep their fragile peace. Now, Carl lived with a family of 4, the mistress and her twins. But where once he had basked in pride, now he lived in regret. The twins were ordinary, their lives marked by mediocrity. The mistress was bitter, her triumph hollow. Their family was fractured, consumed by poverty, haunted by envy. Carl often compared the two families, remembering the fragile peace of his marriage to Maggie and contrasting it with the emptiness of his current life. The comparison was merciless. Maggie had risen, he had fallen. Maggie's son ensured that fall remained permanent. His intelligence was not only brilliance, it was justice. He closed doors to Carl, blocked opportunities, silenced pleas. Every attempt Carl made to re-enter their lives was dismantled with precision. The son's empire was impregnable, his networks loyal, his resolve unbroken. He understood that betrayal carried consequences, that deceit led to ruin, that scorn was silenced by resilience. His father would remain in poverty, not by chance, but by design. Maggie reflected on the journey. She had been scorned for not bearing children, humiliated by whispers, betrayed by her husband. She had bribed a doctor, carried deceit, endured isolation. She had broken down behind closed doors, but she had never surrendered. Her sacrifice had borne fruit, her son had risen, her legacy had triumphed. The world saw her as survivor, as mother of resilience, as the quiet force behind brilliance. Documentaries narrated her story, interviews praised her strength, articles celebrated her sacrifice. Yet Maggie remained private, preferring silence to spectacle. She did not need the world's applause, she had her son's laughter, her son's triumph, her son's justice. Carl and the mistress lived in poverty, stripped of dignity, consumed by regret. Their twins lived in shadows, ordinary and overlooked. Their family was fractured, their legacy erased. Maggie's son lived in brilliance, reshaping industries, silencing scorn, dismantling betrayal. Maggie herself lived in resilience, her dignity intact, her legacy secure. The story had come full circle. Betrayal had scarred her, but resilience had defined her. Scorn had silenced her, but sacrifice had given her voice. Poverty had consumed them, but triumph had carried her forward. Maggie closed her eyes, listening to her son's laughter in the garden. She whispered softly, "We endured. We rose. We triumphed." And in that whisper lay the truth of her journey, a legacy born in silence, forged in sacrifice, and crowned in resilience.